Hi, it's Mike with AskTractorMike.com. I've got a letter today from a viewer asking about a topic that I get a lot of viewer mail about, and that's matching the implement to the tractor horsepower. And this is a different letter today than I normally answer, and I'll tell you why here in a second. The normal question is, can I mount a X implement on my tractor, which puts out X amount of horsepower, and the implement actually requires more horsepower than my tractor puts out. And there's certain attachments or implements that you can't under a horsepower. If you're trying to pull hay equipment, like a disc mower conditioner or a hay baler, you need every bit of horsepower the manufacturer recommends, and if you're on hills, you probably need more. If you're trying to pull anything that goes in the ground, whatever the manufacturer recommends for horsepower, you need every bit of that and possibly more. Most of the time, the question I get revolves around a brush hog. Say you've got a 30-horse tractor, and we ought to differentiate between engine horsepower and PTO horsepower. There's a big difference. There's a horsepower your engine puts out, and then there's parasitic loss to drive the tractor and to run the hydraulics and everything, and then there's what's actually coming out of the little stub shaft of your PTO, and that's what's important when you're trying to match your tractor to your implement. Is not engine horsepower, it's PTO horsepower. So anyway, if you are trying to match a brush hog to a tractor, let's say you're trying to put a 6-foot brush hog, and this is a common question, on a 30-horse tractor. Can you do it? Because normally we'd recommend a 5-foot brush hog on a 30-horse tractor. Well, what I usually tell people is it depends. I'll post a link at the end to a video that I did with the manufacturer where he tells how they rate for horsepower different brush hogs. And so if you're on flat ground and you're not cutting weeds up over the top of the tractor, and your tractor is putting out the horsepower it's advertised for, then yeah, maybe you can get by with a 30-horse tractor 6-foot brush hog. But if you're trying to cut tall weeds and get every bit of that 6 foot, and your horsepower is a little bit marginal and you're going up and down hills and all that stuff, then maybe not. And it's hard for me to say without seeing your property, knowing what condition your tractor's in and all that. Normally what we'd tell people at the dealership if they want to put a 6-foot brush hog on a 30-horse tractor is if you put a 6-foot cutter on, you don't have to cut 6 foot. You do the first time around the field, but after that, if you're bogging the tractor down, just cut 5 feet. Cut it down a foot. Now, why would you not have gotten a 5-foot brush hog to begin with? Well, you know, if you're trying to get done, there's a big difference in the time commitment from a 5 to a 6-foot brush hog. And if you're cutting, you know, this time of year and a little bit later when maybe it's just seed heads and stalks, you can cut 6 foot and not really need as much horsepower as the brush hog is advertised to require. So it all depends. But let's get to today's question, because today's question is a little bit different. This customer is wanting to know if he's putting too much tractor in front of his implements. Let's read the question. The question comes today from Griff, and Griff says, when I purchased my property, the previous owner also sold his tractor and some implements with the property. The tractor was a Ford 5000. The PTO-driven implements were a brush hog, a flail mower, and a wood chipper. He says, I have now purchased a new tractor, a John Deere 5115M, because I will need the additional horsepower for future pecan production implements. My question is about horsepower ratings on implements. I don't know the ratings of any of these implements. Obviously, they're older. How important are horsepower ratings on implements? If they're all 540 PTO, what would be the issues running implements originally bought to run at 62 horsepower, which is what the Ford 5000 was, that will now be driven by a 115 horsepower tractor? Thank you for your advice. Well, Griff, yeah, it's possible to destroy an attachment or an implement with too big a tractor. Hay equipment, I don't know if you all know what tedders are. There's a little attachment called a tedder, and they're made in Italy. They're pretty cheaply built, and what they do is they fluff up hay. You're running through, it's like taking a pitchfork and fluffing it up in the air, and if your hay has been rained on, you can run a tedder through it and fluff it up. Now these tedders, I think the minimum horsepower rating on pulling one of those is like 25 or 30 horsepower. You could pull it with a tiny tractor. Well, you hook a 120 horsepower tractor on a tedder and run it road gear through the field, and you'll blow it up at some point. So there are attachments that you got to be really careful with. But what we're talking about here is attachments that were pulled by a 5000 Ford. And if I'm guessing, we've got some attachments out there now that are third world built that are pretty cheaply made, but back when 5000s were sold, most of the stuff out there was pretty good, pretty solidly built, and not a lot of cheap stuff. So Griff, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's going to be a problem. The fact that you're asking the question tells me what kind of operator you are. And I'm going to tell you my experience in the farm equipment business. There's people that can tear up a bulldozer if they get their tractor out and they just run it wide open. They never maintain it, and they never hear that the engine is straining to pull something. They can tear it up. And then there's people like Griff that are asking, am I going to hurt my tractor? Obviously, he's a concerned operator. I don't think he'll have any problem whatsoever. I'll never forget when I was working at the dealership, we sold a 30 horse tractor and a 5-foot brush hog, the cheapest one that Bush Hog made. It was an RZ60 at that time, a Razorback cutter. That was the cheapest cutter they made. And we had sold literally hundreds of them and never had anybody tear one up. And we sold a 30 horse tractor with a Razorback on it to a guy, and he took it out and tried to clear timber with it and tore it to bits. And I'll never forget, he brought it back in. We were trying to fix it and take care of him as best we could. The guy that was fixing it in our shop, our technician, took me aside and he said, this guy does not deserve to own equipment. He said, Mike, if you or me bought this cutter, even though it is the cheapest cutter that Bush Hog sells, you or I could make it last the rest of our lives. And this guy tore it up in a week. And that's really true. A lot of how long an attachment or an implement will last depends on the guy or lady in the tractor seat. And by the fact that Griff is asking me ahead of time, will his tractor be able to pull this stuff? He's an operator that cares about his equipment, takes care of it, and I think he'll be fine. Now, I will say one thing. If you're trying to pull a smaller attachment, like I'm assuming he's probably got a 6-foot brush hog with a bigger tractor like that, the one thing I will tell you, one piece of advice, when you're pulling it through a field and you get in rough conditions, the tractor is not going to tell you, well, we're in trouble. On the 5000 Ford, if you got in tall grass and it was real thick and the brush hog is straining a little bit, you could feel the tractor bogging down. With the tractor the size of the Deere he's getting, you're not going to feel that at all. The tractor's going to sing right through that, while the brush hog takes the brunt of all the trying to get all that out from under the cutter. So, Griff, I'll tell you, you're probably fine. But bear in mind, if you've got an issue going on with the cutter, you're not going to feel it in the tractor seat like you did with the Ford 5000, and you need to pay attention to that. I'm going to post a video here at the end, link to it, where I interviewed a guy from Woods about how they rate their cutters for horsepower requirements. If you're interested in the topic, watch it. Thanks for watching.